I would like to thank our top sponsors Børge Mo, Mathias Proy, Eivind Josten, Sean Roberts and Fergus Ryan for making this show possible. And welcome to the Cave of Apollos. My next guest is a Finnish draughtsman who has studied painting with Odd Nerdrum and sculpture at the Florence Academy. He asks the question, which lessons can be learned from the strange fate of some 19th century Finnish painters? As he sees it, they were rightfully concerned with the native epos Kalevala, but their desire to find something national in it invariably led to failure. Ideas of progress and styles like symbolism only further removed their work from a truly timeless context. So what makes a universal story? And can you grip the essence of a myth by simply illustrating it? Hjalmar Hagelstam, it's really nice to have you sitting here in that chair.
Thank you, I'm glad to be here.
Now tell us, does any Finnish painting exist at all?
Actually not. You could very well say not. But that is a difficult question because they did paint from the Kalevala after all. And they did take from the folklore and but you could very well say that they changed it so much that it's unrecognizable from what you could say was natural or what you could say was the original so-called Finnish culture. So in that sense, no, there are no Finnish paintings.
Okay, and we'll get to that because we have some things here on the shelf and on the wall. So why don't we start off with you? And because you have a little intriguing story about how you got interested in painting in the first place.
Yeah, well, it all began actually, well, I'm from Finland, Helsinki, as you know, and it all began with an apprenticeship, you could say, I had at my grandfather's auction house, working together with my father when I was around 16, 17. And of course, all kinds of objects go through an auction house, paintings, antiques, modern and classical. So I really got an introduction to, or I got an interest into different objects of all sorts. And amongst my tasks there was to make do a lot of paperwork, so it was always to look up the artist or whatever and write down the details of the year they were born or something. But I always got stuck into reading more and more about the artist. So I was spending actually most of my days not working so much, but just reading about different artists. And that's really got me interested into the whole thing. And it was at the same time that I actually applied to a school. But I think already then I had an interest in more of the figurative ways of doing it and the classical, because I think that just naturally appealed to me much more than the modern. Even though it was also very clear that the modern was much better as an investment, economically speaking. Okay. You could, because that's the big thing about auction houses, you buy and sell things. So I got interested into that, of course, and you could see that if you wanted to make money, you should just buy the modern and resell it in another country or something, and the prices would rocket up or crash. So the interest in the figurative or classical objects was something else actually than the economic part. And I think we'll talk more about that because that is a bit of a mystery still today. What is the quality there? But anyway, that is where the interest began. And I applied to a school, a university, and it was a very modern university.
In Finland?
Yes, in Helsinki. And it was called the Free Art School. And, well, there is a lot of stories I could tell. I mean, but actually it is, it was a strange thing, because coincidentally I discovered Odd Nerdrum also as I applied for this university. And that's when I started to actually think about what was the purpose of it all, right away, thinking why should one paint in the first place, and also becoming more aware of the history of modernism and such things. I mean, I discovered all of this that was on the internet and books about Nerdrum. So when I came to the university, it was actually, I was quite prepared for what I was expecting, and I was already a little bit against it. Mm-hmm. And I think they could tell, also the teachers. They were a little bit surprised. And I couldn't explain myself at all to them either, because I was still very unclear about the ideas why to paint and so on. So once I got there, well, of course my interest was to learn how to paint a figure or something, and we had few classes in that. But every time it was some ridiculous thing. Like, for example, I remember this one time we had a model, and he was sitting in an office chair, and it was, we had the lights on, thank God, but then the teacher came in, and as soon as she came in, and we had already begun, she turned the lights off and told us to search, to find as many colors as we can and paint that. Something, if I remember correctly, it was something like this, and, well, you can imagine the confusion. Mm-hmm. So, and there is many other stories also. So, of course, I didn't find what I was looking for there, in terms of learning to paint.
Right.
Yes.
But when you were at the auction house, because you must have seen quite a lot of different things.
Mm. Yes, and mostly it was very poor quality.
Yeah. So it wasn't like a ooh moment where you suddenly saw this or that?
No, definitely not. Every now and then there does come good works there, but also the problem is a little bit that it's in Finland, and when it comes to Finnish painters, there's very few great works. Actually, only one that I know of is a great work, like really quite at the top, and that's it's a landscape by Gallen-Kallela, who we have on the wall here, and but mostly it's very mediocre works. Actually, it is a lot of amateur works also that you see there. But there was something that caught my attention. It was not only about the paintings, it was the whole tradition of creating beautiful objects, actually, that caught my attention mainly, yes.
So you were not necessarily philosophically aware, but at least aware of some kind of direction you wanted to go.
Yes.
Before you came to that art school.
Yeah, it was the visual that gripped me first. Absolutely. There was no idea, great grand idea or something. And still so far, I don't think there is any idea that has gripped me very much. It's mostly the visual.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay, and then you, I mean, but before you came to Odd Nerdrum, did you go to any other, I mean, you went to Florence Academy for sculpture, but in terms of painting, how did you develop? I mean, you learned a little bit at university, but...
A little bit. I mean, it has basically just been self-learning all the way until I came here, of course.
Okay.
Yes, and I went to the Florence Academy, but that was after I had been here for some time.
Right.
Yes.
And you were there 1 year or something?
Approximately 9 months.
Okay.
So, And well, it was, as I said, it was after I had been here, so I had already, when it came to artistic ideas or whatever, ideas about how to make a painting, going there, it was very different. It was very, very different, because at the Florence Academy it's much more of a focus on technique alone, not so much the storytelling aspect as it is here. So I would often get into arguments with other students, and it was very difficult to try to convince other people of a storytelling, of the quality of storytelling, actually. It seems that especially painters, they mostly concentrate on the visual very often. Meanwhile, actually the customers think much more about the narrative elements.
Right. That's so strange. So what kind of things would they say then? Sort of against storytelling or not? Like, what were their...
Well, it was, they had an academic focus after all, so for example, if the anatomy was wrong, that was a big problem, even if the anatomy would serve the story or the composition much better.
Speaking of the anatomy of this guy here in Rembrandt's Prodigal son.
Right. Yes, I think, well, it's a strange thing because it's not at all apparent here. But if you go into it, of course, it's completely wrong. But that is for sure something they would criticize. Even though it does help the composition. I don't know if you could say that it helps the story in this painting. So that was one of the things.
First and foremost, correct anatomy.
Yes. Yes. That it should be correct. It's a strange idea of naturalism that they have, actually. It's something I have been thinking about, that because painting actually, as I understand it, it should, or to do something great in painting, you should actually be as close to nature as possible. But so I don't understand this conception of naturalism people have, generally speaking.
Because you would initially think that that's even closer to nature because you get all the details or all.
Yes. But maybe that is a thing that has come with the camera or something, because when I talk about nature, it's about the human eye, which you want to reproduce in a painting, in a way. The way the human eye sees the nature, not the way the camera sees the nature. And the camera is the thing which sees all the details. But that is also maybe a bit of the mystery, because how can you say what the human eye sees? I mean, some things are out of focus and some things are very much in focus, but it changes all the time. It's never static.
So how, not to forget your portrait here on the wall, and so how would you describe that based on these ideas that you have in your head? What have you been trying to do here?
Right. Probably as I was painting it, I was trying to get rid of all these ideas in my head and just focus on what I saw, because that is the most important. I think as soon as you try to rationalize it, it becomes a kind of a mannerism, in a way. As soon as you start to question too much what you are about to do, instead of painting... I mean, the way I do it is I paint quite instinctively. I don't think too much about what I'm going to do. And I trust very much in what I see. So I squint a lot and then open my eyes and choose certain things. But I couldn't say that it's a choice made out of a long procrastination or something of a decision.
I mean, I think few painters, I guess, talk in their heads all the time about exactly why they are doing things as they are doing it.
Yes, but at the academy that was an ideal, that you should always step back and not touch whatever you're doing until you have answered a question in your head, or at least proposed a question. So that is a way of rationalizing it to the extreme, I think.
Yeah. Everything has to be as perfect as possible before you take one step further. And
yes, basically, yes. And you have to know it all. I mean, you have to know what you are doing. You have to know, for example, what bone you are painting and how that bone is shaped. But how can you possibly say everyone has different bones, you could say. But if you begin to generalize, that tends to become manneristic, I think, in works in general.
Yeah. And then, I guess if you think like that, you don't choose anymore.
Yeah.
You have to choose a focus, right?
Yes. Yes. But that is a strange thing, because I couldn't say that I do that consciously.
Okay, so...
because, for example, if you have a great discussion with your model as you are making a portrait, it goes much better than if it's very silent and it's a kind of a heavy mood.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's that thing about a natural flowing conversation instead of reading from a script or...
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to get into the flow, as they say.
But who did you paint here?
I painted Thomas Lowland, who is a Norwegian poet.
Whom I've interviewed, yeah.
Yes, that's right. And actually, there is something interesting here, because not only is it about the visual, which I try to be as loyal to as possible, the nature, but also, since he was a poet and I knew that he was applying, he was in a contest at the time.
Oh yeah, with the Civilization magazine? Yeah.
A poetry competition.
Yeah.
And I knew that he was going to win, because I had got the knowledge from beforehand.
Inside.
So that is where I got the idea for the laurel. And the fur was simply something lying around in the studio. So all of these things came about very naturally, almost by coincidence, you could say. I think this is, not to say that this is anything in compared to the Rembrandt, but I think this is a similar way in which Rembrandt worked. To take it from the nature, not only the visual, but also the ideas, the motifs and the details, and only the most fundamental things, you could say, also. For example, with props, it's important to only have the most fundamental things that the person needs. And you can see that, I think, in nature also.
So what are the ideas about contemporary props, or...
How do you mean?
Do you have any ideas about that? I mean, would you take anything as a prop?
Well, you have to have props. It does look strange. I have never seen a painting with just naked people work very well. So, but contemporary props, one thing I could say is that the most important thing is that they should be useful. They should have a meaning in the painting.
Yeah.
So, and it should be very clear what they are used for. If you have a jacket which is windproof, for example, then there should be a lot of wind going on in the painting, or something like this. It should be very clear what the use of different materials are.
Yeah, then you go back to these model studies of the people standing with a stick.
Yes.
Why is the guy standing with a stick? Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, so you have to show very clearly what the meaning is in every way.
But so in that sense, you're verbalizing or thinking carefully through why do you choose these things. But
that's true.
But
yes.
In terms of the actual painting, you will not necessarily be able to explain exactly every little stroke.
Absolutely not. It's a complete chaos. But that is true. That's when you are going to include something completely new, you are going to make a big change. Then you have to think about why should I do it. But it could also be just a visual one, compositionally. Like if you cover something in a painting with your hand and you see that it works much better, but you don't know exactly why. And it could be a big change also. So not all things can be explained very rationally, I think, in a painting. And that is also one of its charms, I think.
Yeah, you can easily end up in some kind of didactic message if the whole meaning is completely clear, like some communist opera or something like
right.
that, or painting, where it's, this is good, he's bad, and there's no questions.
Right, right. Yeah, there should be some ambiguity there. But how you find that, as far as I can say, it's pure coincidence.
I mean, of course, in the beginning, perhaps you think a lot. I have to mix green and red to get that color, and so on and so on. But afterwards, after some time, you're basically thinking with your eyes and with your hand, even though you're not writing an essay about it.
Yeah.
You're thinking in the moment as you're doing it, as some swordsman would think after a lot of training, I guess.
Right.
With not necessarily, I did that exact angle and then I did this, but
yeah,
the experience allows you to sort of not think, quote unquote.
Yeah, or yeah, or do you think that perhaps they think quicker, but they have gotten so used to the questions that they can answer very quick? A plus B is something.
Things go quicker when you have experience, obviously.
Yeah. So perhaps the questions go through their heads, but just very quickly. I don't know.
Yeah, but how does this relate to these Finnish painters that we were going to talk about?
Right.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not entirely sure what the reason is, but something I have noticed with Finnish painters is that as soon as they try to illustrate a scene, whether it is from Kalevala, which is a national Finnish epic, or the Bible, it very quickly falls into this kind of illustrative technique, where you could say it's very dryly painted, and you could say also that it's a little bit comic and superficial in some ways. I mean, and the most important thing, I think, or the most unfortunate thing about it is that it's not believable at all. And I think that is the biggest problem in this, in the works of many Finnish painters. But it doesn't go only for Finnish painters, it's all over the world. You see the same. Yeah. As soon as they get too stuck into the mythology and that they have to illustrate it correctly, even if it doesn't follow nature, what happens in nature, because whatever this is, I have never seen anything of the sort, the flying thing there.
Yeah.
So I think one should be very careful when including fantastical creatures or anything of the sort into paintings, especially. Because ideally a painting should be as clear in the message as possible. And that is also a little bit the problem with symbolism, that it uses all these symbols which one has to know beforehand to understand the work.
So what generally are their background when it comes to their education? Like what?
Generally speaking, at least in Finland, they studied in academies first, doing this stick holding people. And then actually abruptly beginning to paint mythological scenes like this. I mean, it has no, there is no sense in this, in my opinion. From people holding sticks into this, well, it's a strange kind of a development.
Yeah, it's taking that stick literally, and so it's sort of the same mindset.
Actually, yes, yeah. And the message is just as unclear in both of them.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
And well, but it's not completely hopeless, because as soon as I also noticed when I was going through all these Finnish painters, that as soon as they chose more natural motifs and motifs from nature. They had live models and everything. It looks much better immediately and much more believable, first and foremost. And something I wonder about, why is that believability such a big quality? Since it has been one since the ancient Greeks, actually. There, I think, actually, because you could say that painting began with believability. That the greater you were, how good of a painter you were was based on how believable you could paint things.
But what do you think is, I mean, these were academically trained painters.
Yes.
So what is it about that makes it difficult for them to make mythical imagery?
I don't know if it's exactly that which makes it difficult, that they had an academic training, but it's definitely they definitely seem to have the wrong focus. I don't entirely know what their focus was. Perhaps it could have been this national focus that they had to create an identity, but even then, I don't see why you should do that. Why you should want to create an identity when the greatest works are always those which are most styleless, you could say.
Money.
Oh yeah, that's right. A political motif.
Yeah,
perhaps.
you get sent out abroad when the state pays for you to be included in different exhibitions.
Right. Yes, that makes sense.
Now, I was just asking that question because another painter whom we don't have represented here, Albert Edelfelt, who made some really nice illustrations of this poem by Rembrandt.
Oh yes.
And he talks about how he gave up sort of history painting because you hadn't experienced it yourself.
If you hadn't
experienced it yourself, you hadn't seen it yourself.
Is that why it was a criticism by him?
Yeah, according to that quote, that's what he said.
I think that's very illustrative of how their focus was very strange, because, I mean, when it comes to history painting, ideally it should be a story that people can recognize through time. So I suppose Edelfelt was not considering that idea at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they must have been a little bit confused in that area, because as a history painter at the time you should choose a certain motif, but I guess it could be anything. They did not have this universal ideal that anyone could understand it from being from any culture whatsoever. Although that is a little bit strange with Rembrandt, because this is a rather Christian motif, I think. Of course the story is Christian, but also the act of forgiveness is not exactly something that comes naturally to human beings, I think. Although it is something that they can do. And I think that is something that is so great about Rembrandt, is that he shows that which is particularly human in comparison to other animals. The act of forgiveness, and there was another thing I was thinking about, because there is two things here. It's the act of forgiveness. Well, and you could also say it is the punishment, but that is a little bit unclear. I mean, you have talked about it before with the punishing eye and the forgiving one. Oh yeah,
it's Odd Nerdrum was mentioning that. Yeah.
Yes.
There's two and two different hands.
Yes, there. But actually, the one I was thinking about was the shame that the prodigal son feels. That is also particularly human. And I think it is so wonderful that he has managed to show both of those and to show it in such a grand manner, in a way. There is a word for it. He has, he has lifted it up in a way. elevated it. Yes, that's right.
So how would you then explain the difference between that and to stick to Gallen-Kallela here? Not only this painting, but in general, you could say, I guess, there's Pekka Halonen also, another painter who dealt with the Kalevala motifs.
He has the same problem.
Yeah. So what is the difference then is it that there's forgiveness and not forgiveness in their work? Or?
There isn't, not at least in this sincere manner in which Rembrandt shows it. That is actually maybe one of the clearest differences here is the sincerity of the two paintings. But it seems to me that the focus is something very different here. I mean, it is, in a way, the focus is to create like a stylized icon or something.
In Gallen-Kallela, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in the Rembrandt, I mean, it's beyond life in the Rembrandt. I don't know what to call it. This painting is a mystery to me, absolutely. And we should mention that it's in the center because it is in some ways the center of what we are trying to create in the classical tradition. This is in some ways in the center. It is also in some ways, you could say, an improvement from the Greeks, whom we have not mentioned yet.
And so you can introduce our third guest here?
Yes, well, this is a sculpture called The Dying Gaul, and I believe it is a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture, which was commissioned to celebrate the victory over the Celts or the Gauls. But the amazing thing about it, I think, is how honorable they have shown their adversaries or the ones they defeated. And not only the ones they defeated, but the ones who were invading the Greeks. And afterwards they made these sculptures. That truly shows something that I think we've lost. I don't think you could see anything of the sorts in a public statue today. Just imagine after this terrible war is over what they will create. Actually, I don't want to imagine that.
Oh, God.
So that shows something about the respect I think the Greeks in general had for human beings. I mean, they thought of themselves as divinities, especially the kings, the sons of gods. So
I mean, that's such a beautiful idea in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Which was a central book for them, obviously.
Right.
Where he meets Nausicaa and asks if she's a goddess or a human being. Who are you? To meet someone like that, it's the same as saying hello to the god in the other person.
Right. Yeah, that's...
what to describe here with the dying Gaul. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that is a kind of an idea that you have to have in order to create something like this. Because this, the Prodigal Son of Rembrandt, it looks like an image from another world, really. You don't find this calm, this bliss very much in this world we live in. Or at least, well, I certainly have never seen it. I don't suppose you have either. I think very few people would ever see such a scene in real life, and that is the wonder of painting, that it can create something so, what shall you call it, magical or, yeah.
That's interesting what you're saying, and that what's the right word? The reason for painting, or would you say that the reason for someone painting has to be then empathy and not correct technique first and foremost? Like the driving force.
Yes.
I mean, you learn all those other things because of some driving force.
Yes, right? Of course. Yeah. There is another focus there.
Yeah.
It's not I mean, the point isn't to create a good painting. The point is something else. What that something else is a little bit difficult to say, I think. But you should absolutely highlight the human aspects. Because that is the only thing I see that would have meaning. Or that could help you develop a painting. But what it improves, I don't entirely know. What you could say is the quality or meaning of improvement. I mean, why you should want to improve a painting. Is it simply a question of pleasure? That seems to me a little bit. No, it's not a bad reason, but one would wish for something higher, I suppose. But perhaps we don't have access to that in this life.
What would it be?
Well, it would of course be something divine, something higher. But how to put that into words, I can't.
Well, you can. Well, images say more than 1,000 words.
Yes.
I was just thinking.
Yes.
Because I went. Yeah. Sorry.
No. Please continue. I was just.
So, what would you draw from this comparison? And if you put this next to, and I agree with you. I think a lot of these Finnish painters are better as academic painters than as symbolic painters. But if you put the Prodigal Son next to one of these naturalist or academic paintings, what is the most obvious difference there? What do you take from that?
Actually, the most obvious difference is definitely to put it very concretely, it's the contrast in the painting. So you could say it's the drama aspect. That is
on a pure technical level, you mean?
Yes, actually. And then when you go into the details or the faces, you will see that there is a great difference there also in the sincerity and depth of character and emotion. So those are probably the two main things. The most apparent one is absolutely the drama. Usually in naturalist paintings it's quite flat and it's very light also. They don't have the 85% black that we have talked about as a fundamental.
Well, isn't one aspect that when you look at their academic work, that it's more quite simply everyday? Like
yes, yes, you could say that they have not, but it's not really everyday because they have in some ways simplified the everyday even further. Because if you want to capture the everyday, then you should stay there every day, and then it could become something timeless, actually. If you were to stay there every day and watch the same motif happen over and over and over, then I think you might get something closer to this. So what the naturalists achieve is unfortunately something a little bit below that, I think.
Well, that is interesting. So that means that they're thinking more like a photograph.
Yes, absolutely. That's it's in a way that's particular. They are thinking in the particular, that this particular way of doing something, not the way that it is generally done, perhaps you could say. An act of some sort, an act, usually a human act of some sort. But it doesn't have to be human. A great painting can be of a dog also, but it has to be like an eternal picture of a dog, how a dog eternally acts something, you know.
Yeah. And that's a very Greek idea.
Oh yes, that's what we're trying to do. Emulate the Greeks.
Have you compared Greek work to Roman works? Sculptures?
I have seen the difference, yes. But the problem also a little bit with the Romans is that they mostly copied the Greeks. very rarely do you see an original Roman work. I can't think of a single one, or a mention of a Roman sculptor. So for them it
and they
seems...
were Greeks.
Yeah,
well,
exactly. So in some ways you could say that they were a little bit more similar to the Gallen-Kallela, actually, because they were just using these sculptures or copies of sculptures for another purpose, a political one perhaps, or personal, private benefit one, or something of the sort.
And I think once you compare this Greek way of doing it, which is not a photograph of that person, to the Romans, which is much more so.
Yes.
Then the leap from the Roman up to academic painting, that's perhaps, those two are perhaps closer. Or what do you think
The
about
Romans and the academics?
Yeah.
Oh yes, absolutely. It falls much more in the illustrative rather than going closer to life. Yes, absolutely. But it's very... I'm trying to think always, why do they fall into that? What is it that makes it so illustrative? What is it they lack? Well, they lack the drama, but to say that they lack the sincerity, that probably means also that I mean, to talk of a particular draftsman, it means that they lack the focus in what is really important, and they have another one in mind, which is probably a social one. Well,
I'm thinking about something that you mentioned when we were finding out what to talk about, and that is a really fundamental question, or it is definitely a big aspect of this. The experience of the painter, the experience with life. Because you said, does the painter have to have gone through like a lot of difficulties, and then automatically become a good painter, or what can teach you to become a good painter besides technique?
Right. Well, it is absolutely experience of life, or experience of books, or I mean, you have to really get into the culture, you know. What are you involved in? The classical culture. And that is, you know, you could say it's a big package. There's a lot involved there. Music, poetry, sculpture, painting, architecture, whatever. But as I have understood it, and not very much experienced it myself, but I do think that the most important thing is experience of life.
So you have something to talk about.
Yes, something to say, something to tell, basically. I mean, you could think of a painting, I think, as something you would tell your child, you know. Would you tell them, what is the first thing that you would tell? You would tell a story from your life, of course.
Well, I tell them myths and stuff.
Yes. You do? Okay, well then I'm wrong. Never mind. But surely those myths are something that you recognize from your own life. Would you say so?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there, you made some slight distinction between having experienced some, let's say, some traumatic thing personally, or you mentioned the thing about reading things. But then I guess you're talking about, again, the empathy of the person reading.
But that is something they can grow through reading and
I mean, that can become experience, at least to a certain...
In a way, it can go, I think it can go to your unconsciousness, and but it is always a kind of a second-hand experience. And for example, when it comes to books, it's never as visual as life, because you can never really capture life as it is, although Rembrandt certainly...
It's not an image.
No. So especially when it's in your head, it's much more vague than if it had actually happened to you. So therefore it is, in a way, it's the most powerful thing, or most, it has most substance, you could say, when you actually experience it yourself, I think, yes.
So the typical go-to example for me, at least, is The Sick Child by Edvard Munch. I mean, of course, we know the biography that his sister died from tuberculosis and so. But it just struck me right now that, of course, there was a fashion of sick children being painted.
Yeah.
So then he had a form, and then he could put his experience into the form, to a certain extent.
Yes. And also there is another very interesting thing about that painting, is that Munch apparently tried to recreate it exactly as he remembered it. So what he remembered, this particular detail, when he was close to finishing it, just as an example, he remembered that his eyebrows had an effect on the scene. So he painted a lot of slashing strokes at the top to shroud, to make it more lifelike, to capture the human eye. Exactly what we were talking about.
Wow.
So he was extremely aware of these things, God knows how.
Wow, that's advanced.
Wow. Yes. It's just one thing, he must have thought of all of it, from beginning to end. What is it that makes it most lifelike? And it's very far from this naturalistic idea, because just as a critic said when that painting was first exhibited, the hands look like sledgehammers. So, or I think it was a fellow painter who said to Munch, come now, you cannot paint hands like sledgehammers. Have some respect.
Well, that's the same thing here. You cannot paint a man who doesn't have his thighs.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like a midget, but it works. It works.
What is that? Why can things work when they are obviously technically wrong?
That is a mystery, but there is the thing about it fitting the composition, and then you could talk about a certain proportions in the painting, that perhaps it fits a certain ratio, the golden ratio. I don't know. There are many different ratios. Perhaps that is one thing, because if that man's had very long legs, it would not work. So he has put the composition over the naturalism here.
Story, first and foremost.
Story, yeah. Do you think that is the same as composition?
Yeah, well, composition is one thing you do to get the story across. Right?
Yeah. Yes. That's right.
Yeah, and I think, well, as you mentioned, or as we talked about, when you have, I mean, you said when it comes to deciding whether a prop should go in, then you're really verbalizing or thinking or reasoning. And once you include it there, or you know it's there, then the so-called quote-unquote unconscious just starting to paint kicks in, right?
Yes, because how shall you... I mean, you can think about the story. I mean, if you're going to paint a story, it should be all quite clear. And you can step back and think, okay, so who are these people now? And where are they? And what do they need?
Why on earth is it holding that?
Yeah, but then when you begin to paint and you're looking at something, it's a chaos. I mean, what are you looking at? It's changing all the time. The colors are changing, the light is changing. There is no system there that you can follow. And actually, you should very much avoid, I think, following a system when it comes to painting nature.
That can be misunderstood.
Yes, well, but at the same time you should basically submit to nature. This you cannot possibly say, unless you are extremely arrogant. I don't think anyone would say that they are over nature. They have more power than nature. You know, lightning can kill you in a second or something.
Yeah.
So,
but then you're back to the eyelashes on Munch's Sick Girl.
Yes,
that he actually, like I say, obeyed nature. As you said, how the human eye sees things.
Yes.
And the naturalist, with all the details, does not obey nature the way we see things, because obviously it's how humans see it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another story about Munch that illustrates that same point that you're making, where a colleague of his, he was well, exactly like these Finnish painters, educated, academic, and then tried to be a bit symbolic after a while. And he saw that Munch was painting something in Saint-Tropez or something in France. And there was a green grass there and a tree. And then he takes a stroke of the green up a little bit on the trunk of the tree. Yeah, because that's, when he just looked at it, that's how it appeared.
Yeah.
That same point again, but just a different example.
I'm sure if you asked him, he could not answer why he did it in any other way except that that's how I saw it. That's how it was in nature. But he couldn't say that this is how nature looks, because one moment it could look like the grass does not go up to the tree. The tree is very clearly outlined. If the wind was blowing another way or something, you know. So this is why I say that there is no system to it. Although you can use certain methods, certainly, you can generalize a little bit, and I certainly do that when I paint, to make certain areas more atmospheric and to bring more form in other areas, to flatten some parts and bring forth others, although that also has to do with the focus. What is more important? Is the eye more important, or a pimple on the cheek more important?
All right.
Yes.
So that suddenly you discover that you don't have to have the focus on the eyes in every portrait.
Right.
For example.
No, but very often you do.
Yeah.
And some painters would say that always you should have that focus on the eyes, which I can understand, because the eyes are in some ways the opening to the soul, whatever that is.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can see that in Odd Nerdrum's work, sometimes the open mouth and the eyes are almost non-existent. What about this idea of, you mentioned this distinction also before we sat down now, between calmness and action?
Well, the prodigal son here is you have the two opposites here in a way. I mean, this is one of the calmest paintings that I think I have ever seen. It's completely still. There isn't a sound in this work, so to speak. There isn't a sound in any painting, but especially in this one, there is no sound. Meanwhile, in this one, well, actually, it's probably not what Gallen-Kallela intended, but I get a kind of a circus melody in my head from this painting. So it's a strange thing, because actually paintings give a kind of a melody, even if you are a composer or not. Especially composers get melodies from paintings, but even if you are not, I think people generally get a sort of a sound or a feeling from looking at a painting. But how to reach the calmness, and whether the calmness is so important. Oftentimes the greatest works are very calm. I think a part of it comes from a technical quality to them, that they are often very soft. Very soft paintings are often very calm. For example, with Carrière, you see that all over. And also Rodin, or softness is one great thing one can, or a kind of an effect one can do to calm down a piece. And it is actually something you don't see in Rubens. or it's a complete chaos.
It's true, yeah.
He's never soft, always quite sharp. Ideally, you have the combination. Carrière is a little bit too soft at times. Although in his greatest works, he has that combination. You could say the contrapposto of sharp and soft.
Right.
That is something very important.
That's a nice way of phrasing it. It's a contrapposto of soft and sharp.
Yes.
I'll appropriate that one.
Yes, well, you have talked about it before, combining opposites, always combining opposites.
Yeah.
If you combine as many, I remember you said once, if you combine as many opposites as possible, you will create a masterpiece.
That is so strange. That is so strange to have sharp lines and sort of foggy transitions, to stick to that example. But why is it? I mean, you would think that more action, gesticulation, sort of quote-unquote Baroque, would be more appealing or more true because people move around, they don't just stand still all the time. Do you have any ideas about that?
I don't know. I mean, it absolutely requires the softness, after all, and the stillness. If it doesn't have that, well, you could say that if it's all action, it doesn't mean anything. Because you have to have the contrast to give meaning to something. If everything is the same, then nothing is... It's nothing. So you have to have a contrast to give something meaning, actually.
There's a contrapposto there too.
Yes. There always has to be a contrapposto.
So well, you mentioned Gallen-Kallela here, but what's old masterwork, or what would be an unsuccessful one then, where there's too much noise?
Of Gallen-Kallela, or
no, just general old
well,
masters.
we mentioned Rubens, but there are plenty of others, of course. I mean, actually, not to be too harsh, but most of painting history falls into that trap. Painting, I say painting, but any cultural field, whatever, it falls into that trap of having too much of something and too little of something else. Because a painting can very well have too much softness also, and too much stillness. You
can always hide behind being painterly.
Yes, also. You can hide behind all of these things, and that is so interesting, that you always have to have the opposite. That is actually, you could say, one of the rational parts of painting, that you can step back and think, what am I doing now, and what is the opposite of what I'm doing now? And then you will probably improve a lot the work. That could be a great rule for a painter. Always think what is the opposite of whatever you have reached. Whatever effects. That is an idea.
That is a very good idea. That at least is a general tip that can suddenly help you realize what might be lacking. Yeah, you mentioned also the poor fisherman.
Yes.
I think the idea that...
By...
Chavannes. Puvis de Chavannes.
Puvis de Chavannes, that's right. Which you could say has very little... I mean, the academics would throw this painting to the trash, or...
After having thrown up.
Yes. It has very little technical merit, but it has so much of what actually matters, and that is the human side of it. And that is what keeps the weight. I mean, that is what gives the painting weight and importance.
What is the human side of it? I know it's difficult with these big words, but...
The human side of that painting... God, I'm having trouble picturing it now in my head. The man is praying
in the boat.
In
there,
the boat.
and then there's the woman.
That
there.
is clearly, even though it's not one of our strong suits, that is a human aspect that he's praying. But mostly the human aspect is in the expressions of the people, especially the man, who has this melancholy in him. I don't know so much how much melancholy other animals have, but
maybe horses do. They have nice.
Yeah, well, you know, some people say that horses are the ones who bring human beings to the afterworld, so that would make sense. The Greeks did that, in fact. But anyway, that is definitely the sincerity in the poor fisherman, that it has this wonderful melancholy in it, not only in the expressions but the colors also. And when I said that it doesn't have very much technical merit, I mostly meant in the rendering of it lacks very much in the believability. It's closer, actually, I would say, to the Gallen-Kallela than the Rembrandt, in some ways, because...
except for the strong colors.
That's right, yeah. It doesn't have as strong colors.
That always helps.
Yes. But it also has this very simplistic composition, big flat shapes, which you...
That's it.
See a lot in a lot of great works, always the big flat, the most important things without too many details. But it has a little bit of this illustrative side that we see in Gallen-Kallela here. And that is why you couldn't, if you would compare it to the Rembrandt here, this would be by far greater, I think.
Well, you can just do the squint test.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That shows where the focus is.
Yes.
And goodness me, I have not done it with this one before. The focus is in the sunset in the back and various flats of color. Meanwhile, in this one, it's so clearly in the human beings.
Yeah.
So...
I mean, let's see what happens to this guy when you squint. And then suddenly it's like that film trick when you zoom in as you go backwards, or how is it? And then this figure suddenly comes forward.
Yeah.
And becomes important.
Right. Oh, yes.
I all the time try to in my head compare Rembrandt's Prodigal Son to these, because I went through quite a lot of these different Finnish painters just to get some idea. I mean, of course, there's a lot of similar things in every European country in that time. But when you see these typically everyday pictures walking across a pond or reading a book or something like that,
yes.
and that's what they're doing. There's nothing else happening than what the title is. And I just cracked up because I was thinking of something that Robert McKee says in Story. I think I'm quoting him correctly. He says that if the story is about what the story is about, then you're fucked.
Okay.
Because it's only that one thing happening.
Okay. That's interesting. So you kind of you get the title and you hope to find something even more, but then it's only that thing and you are disappointed.
That's it.
That makes sense, yes.
Girl reading.
Yes. Oh, well, it's ridiculously flat, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No more content than that.
No. And the return of the prodigal son. Yeah, that is interesting because in most of them it is literally the return. He is returning. In a way, this one has a false title because he has already returned and now he is on his knees. So the title tells of something that has already happened. But actually in most paintings of the return of the prodigal son, you see the prodigal son on his way to the father. He's literally returning.
Yeah.
Most disappointing.
That's interesting. The moment with less emotional potency.
Yes. Yes, and perhaps that is the issue. That if you don't go in depth, you will just illustrate the title as it is, which the titles very often have very little interest. When it's interesting, you could compare it to when someone first begins to explain to you something that you have never heard of before. You are, generally speaking, very uninterested. And you feel a little bit bored. Oh God, what are we talking about now? And then when they tell you more and more and more, and tell you more and more details, and they get more and more in depth, then your interest begins to awake. So I think this tells of how, as a painter, you have to, when you choose a motif, you have to go as in depth as possible into that motif. Study everything that could possibly happen in a certain story and choose what is most important, what is most striking, or what you recognize best as a human being. Well, after all, the painters are human beings also.
We have to admit.
They have to have that focus also. Oh my God, they should not forget that.
Well, that's, I guess, is what is forgotten when you just make those photograph pictures of girl reading or a boy walking across a bridge or whatever else they're doing.
Right. They begin to think of themselves as painters, not as human beings.
Yeah.
Like a new race of some sort. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but actually that seems to be the case. They forget that which is human, so they become something else.
Yeah, that is a fundamental misunderstanding. What's your idea about that? I think a lot of painters, if they're not philosophically aware, they're sort of in spite, they shall paint really detailed to be even better than the bloody modernists.
Right.
And then they end up exactly in that trap of losing the human content because they're more concerned with being...
Yes, I mean, they get concerned with their ego in a way, that I shall show that I am much better than this person or something.
That's exactly
like
what Nietzsche is saying about the Romans in The Birth of Tragedy.
Oh?
Yeah. It's about me being skilled, not about making some archetypal content.
That's right. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. It's not totally hopeless, although most painters throughout history have fallen into that trap. But I do think that it's kind of a question of the love a painter has for the motif, and therefore they would show it truthfully. If they were to love it so much that they would want to show it sincerely. And I do think that is something you can teach. It's a kind of... you could compare it to like Hinduism, which you can teach very well people, even though it has so much to do with what is the most important. I mean, in Hinduism... I don't pretend to know so much about it, but as far as I've understood it, the focus is on that which is human, and they have this idea of the balance, that things should always be in balance. And anyone who is born into that culture, they learn it through example. So that is... something that could potentially create another Renaissance. And that is, I think, the only thing one can do, really, is to set a great example of what to do.
I think you're ready to have children.
Oh, God. No, but, you know, it's quite funny because...
What you're saying is absolutely true.
Yeah, and it's a strange thing because someone has to decide that someone has to make the decision that this is great, this is something that is great, and this is how we should do it. And then they can begin to take up the responsibility, you know, and show the example.
I forgot almost that we have a question from a people.
Oh yeah.
So I just want to hear what you say about that, and then you can give us some famous last words at the end.
Oh God, yeah.
So, sorry. How was your experience at the Florence Academy of Art? Would you recommend studying there to learn painting technique, parentheses, and then use what you learn into storytelling later?
Yes, absolutely. It was very useful to simply practice the technical side. And if you already have a narrative mind and you naturally think in narrative motifs, then I think it's extremely useful. But if you don't have that, then I think your focus should be something else. You should try to develop your narrative qualities, because you could say that every person has those qualities to a greater or to a smaller or larger extent, but they have to be developed as every other quality. So, so basically, I would say that it depends on. You should be very aware of what are your qualities as a painter, and then make the decision if you want to study there or not. Because they have some very particular things that they can teach very well, but
there are other things to be aware of as well. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
For example, how do you become more mythical in your motifs?
Right.
So give us the bullet points on that.
Well,
this is how you do it.
How do you become more mythical? Then
you said a lot already. It's not like you haven't touched upon the subject.
No, but when you put it like that freshly, then I think it's very important to mention that one should be very careful that this is not the mythical thing that we are talking about. It's this here, which is about the
Rembrandt.
It is about an eternal human moment, in a way. This is a father forgiving his son, but it is a human being forgiving another human being, which is something very unique and wonderful human beings can do.
That's a great way to end. So, Hjalmar Hagelstam, thank you for coming to the Cave of Palace.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. Remember to head over to caveofpalace.com/subscribe and become a member today. I'll see you next month.